Hello, I'm Yanna Krupnikov.
And I'm John Barry Ryan.
And we will be talking about our new book, The Other Divide.
Why did we call our book The Other Divide? Calling the book The Other Divide implies that there's another book that could have been written about a different divide that is unstated but clearly important. After all, the divide at the center of this book is the other one, not the one everyone is thinking about. Well, the unstated, more familiar divide is the partisan divide between Democrats and Republicans. And the other divide, the divide at the heart of our book, is the divide between those people who make politics an essential part of their lives and those who do not.
In this book, we define and measure a concept we call involvement, which is essentially how much people focus on politics. The measure is a continuum, but it is easier to understand the argument if we can divide people into three groups. One group includes people who almost never follow politics. They aren't interested in discussing politics, and they know very little about politics. Some people, a much larger group, know major political actors. They can check in with politics, and they're going to discuss politics on occasion. And then there's a third group of people who follow politics almost constantly throughout the day. They know even small details of political events, and they frequently discuss politics. We can think of this first group of people as being inattentive or entirely uninvolved with politics. We can think of the second group as being attentive or at least somewhat attentive to politics. And then this third group of people is a group whose focus on and attention to politics is outsized. They are, to foreshadow our core argument, deeply involved in politics. The divide between this third group, the deeply involved, and everyone else is key to understanding modern American politics. It would seem natural to think that this third group has a lot in common with the second group, people who are sometimes attentive and sometimes involved in politics. Both of these groups know the basics, and they are likely to know what's going on in the news, and they typically vote. We will argue and show that the deeply involved group is unique in a variety of ways that are consequential to American politics.
It is this deeply involved group that has affected how many political observers evaluate the state of American politics. Many assume that the polarization that exists in modern America is experienced similarly by the vast majority of Americans. But this is not the case. Many Americans do dislike the political elites of both parties, but they do not necessarily direct this anger at ordinary voters. The loud, angry partisans that have come to define this modern political era of hyper-partisanship for so many, what we show in this book, they're largely concentrated in the group of the deeply involved.
In this way, the other divide is actually the fundamental divide. On one side is a minority of Americans who are deeply involved in politics. On the other side is the majority of Americans who have much less investment in day-to-day political outcomes. These two groups have different social networks, different policy preferences, different ideas about family life and child rearing, and, of course, different beliefs about political parties. The deeply involved do genuinely dislike rank-and-file members of the other party. This group may even wish ill on out-partisans. The deeply involved also genuinely think highly of their own party. But more Americans, those who are not deeply involved, are skeptical about the actions and motivations of partisan elites generally.
People who are deeply involved in politics are also more likely to express their opinions. They discuss politics with others, and they are more likely to raise their voices via social media. In turn, journalists have become drawn to exemplars of angry partisans, which means the information people get about American politics has become flooded with news about political hatred and partisan contempt. Though they form a minority, the amplified voices of the deeply involved are perceived as the voices of most, if not all, Americans. America appears more divided by politics because when people visualize politics, the pictures in our heads are of the deeply involved. And the deeply involved are, in fact, profoundly divided by politics.
We outline our argument in 9 chapters. Chapter 1 introduces the concept of the other divide, that is, the involvement divide. But before we can talk about involvement in more detail, we first need to talk about the partisan divide, the better-known divide in American politics. So in Chapter 2, we draw out the nuance in political science research on affective polarization. Nuance that is often missing from the translation of this research to media coverage. 2 main ideas emerge in Chapter 2. The first is that, without a doubt, there are people in America who harbor an unconditional animosity for the opposing party. There are likely more of these types of people now than there were 2 decades ago. For many people, however, most of their political animosity is directed toward partisan elites and members of the opposing party who are very vocal about their political positions. Some people seem to dislike the political opposition, but many other people just seem to dislike politics. Jointly, these 2 ideas set the stage for the remainder of the book. What if a dividing line in American politics is broader than just people's attachment to party, but is actually about their attachment to politics itself?
We begin exploring this other divide in Chapter 3 through a theory of political involvement. Relying on an interdisciplinary approach, we outline the characteristics of deep involvement. 1. Spending a tremendous amount of time on a topic. 2. Interpreting even mundane events as being highly important. And 3. Seeking out social interactions related to politics. In the same chapter, we also discuss the implications of deep involvement for political behavior and political outcomes. We consider what deep involvement means for news habits and political discourse. We also explore why people who are deeply involved in politics may be especially likely to harbor animosity towards the opposing party.
The next 4 chapters are devoted to analyzing just how different the deeply involved are from the majority of Americans. In Chapter 4, we walk through the development and validation of our main measure, as well as the distribution of the measure across different types of samples. After the introduction of this measure, Chapter 4 focuses on a series of descriptive, exploratory analyses that track the relationship between involvement and traditional correlates of political behavior. Across these analyses, we find evidence that involvement divides the American public. Higher levels of involvement are associated with stronger partisanship, more ideological extremity, and greater affective polarization. More notable, however, is that involvement divides co-partisans. People who are deeply involved prioritize different political issues than those who are less involved. Finally, we find that those who are deeply involved have a much greater sense of political efficacy across a variety of indicators. And people who are deeply involved have much more certainty in their political views.
In Chapter 5, we turn to a more challenging question. What might lead people to become deeply involved in politics? We rely on a foundation of research in political science and psychology to focus on one factor that scholars have long suggested is pivotal to people's political development: their socialization. Therefore, in Chapter 5, we consider how a variety of social experiences, family interactions, educational contexts, and friendship networks relate to involvement. We find that deep involvement is associated with more early-in-life political socialization. It is also more heavily associated with a very specific college experience. Turning to people's social networks, we find involvement bubbles. People tend to associate with others who are equally as involved or uninvolved as they are.
In Chapter 6, we consider the relationship between involvement and parenting because people's views on parenting are revealed preferences of their most fundamental values. People's views about how children should spend their time speak to their beliefs about what is most important in a society. We find that, generally, people prefer parents who avoid politics. The participants in our studies seem uncomfortable with parents who explicitly encourage kids to be political. The group that seems most comfortable with political parenting, however, are the deeply involved. The deeply involved are different, and these differences become more important if they are exacerbated by unequal political voices. In other words, it is less important that involvement affects which issues co-partisans find important if people at all levels of involvement are equally likely to be heard by policymakers. In the next sections of the book, we consider whether that is actually the case.
To address questions of political voice and expression, in Chapter 7 we rely on a series of tests to track whether people who are more involved in politics are more likely to discuss politics with others, and more likely to post their positions to social media. Moving beyond relationships between involvement and expression, we next investigate what this tendency of the deeply involved to express their political positions means for people who are less involved. We find a notable tension. The deeply involved express their political positions because they believe they are informing others about important political outcomes and events. Those who are less involved, however, see this form of political expression less charitably. They do not believe political expression on social media is designed to inform, but rather that it is designed to somehow bolster the status of the person doing the posting.
Chapter 8 tracks the broader implications of the involvement gaps documented in the previous chapters by exploring the possibility that the voices of the deeply involved are especially likely to be amplified by the media. So, unlike previous chapters, which focus on the American public, Chapter 8 turns to elites, political journalists. Weaving together research on journalistic practice, surveys of journalists, a content analysis, and qualitative interviews with journalists, we argue that journalists end up amplifying the deeply involved because they often focus on covering political polarization among the public. Because journalists often seek to create narratives that will be accessible and interesting to their readers, these stories are also likely to include exemplars of polarization, regular people who personify political divisions. Exacerbating these patterns is an increasing reliance on social media, which overrepresents the voices of the deeply involved.
We conclude in Chapter 9 by turning the spotlight on people who are not deeply involved. Not being involved should not be confused with being apathetic or not caring about political outcomes. Indeed, most people who vote in elections are not deeply involved. One should not assume deep involvement is synonymous with caring. Rather, it reflects a very particular engagement with politics. We also return to a question asked nearly 70 years ago by Berelson, Lagersfeld, and McPhee. What would it mean to have a public that is fully deeply involved? And we conclude where we began. There is a fundamental political divide between the deeply involved and the majority of the public. America's political divisions are linked to this other divide.